Hey everyone, welcome to the AnexiPod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 7 for October 5th, 2016. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Enterprise Architect for Infrastructure Solutions at Anexinet by day and crime-fighting Darkwing Duck by night. Here on the AnexiPod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we will be talking to Scott Lowe about what it means to be a full-stack engineer, how he got started on his journey, and how you can get started on your own. Before we jump into the interview, I wanted to do a little housekeeping. If you're joining me for the first time, you'll be excited to know that there are 6 other episodes to gorge yourself on. The feedback I've received so far has been overwhelmingly positive, so thank you to everyone. The main criticism is the length of the podcast, which, in retrospect, I agree. I'd like to keep the whole thing under an hour and keep the content interesting. With that in mind, I will be stripping out the Anexibites and personal rants to focus on the interviews. I am considering starting another sister podcast to cover news and thoughts on the industry, including a cohort of my coworkers, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, enjoy this invigorating interview with Scott Lowe, and I'll be back on the other side for a quick wrap-up. Today I'm joined by Scott Lowe, writer, technologist, and 20-year veteran in the field. I first found Scott's blog when searching for information on using Vagrant to quickly build lab environments. Since then, I've continued to return to his blog to learn about new and exciting technologies that are coming to fruition. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Oh, thank you, Ned. I appreciate it.
For those who don't already know who you are, can you give a little background on your journey through IT?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I've been in the industry, I don't know, around 20 years or so. I guess depends on which job you count as your first official job. I started out in departmental IT, although at the time it was called IS, Information Systems, not Information Technology. And, just doing the usual kind of, departmental IT support stuff. Found that I enjoyed teaching people. So I took a job as an instructor. And out of that, found that I really enjoyed the real technical aspects of it. I was teaching a class, if you can believe it, on how to pass the certification on Windows 3.1 and DOS.
Wow, so 3.1 and DOS.
Yeah, I know that really dates you right there. But I really enjoyed the technical side of it, so I took a job as a technical instructor and was teaching certification classes back in the day for Windows NT and MCSE, all that kind of jazz. Did that for a few years. Then moved on to a VAR, doing both pre and post sales engagements. Ran my own company for a few years doing consulting. That was a lot of fun. In 2010, I moved into the vendor space. I took a job with EMC Corporation as the global field CTO for their VMware Affinity team, also known as the V Specialists. Spent a few years there, and then in 2013, I joined the NSX team at VMware, which is where I still am. And along the way, I've been blogging. You mentioned that you found me via my blog, which is common. I've been blogging since 2006, and I had the opportunity to write a few books. First book published in 2009, and I've had the pleasure to talk to a lot of folks at different conferences and events and stuff all around the world.
Wow, that sounds like quite a journey. And speaking of a journey, you have a podcast. It's called The Full Stack Journey. I've listened to most of the episodes you posted so far, and I think it's a really informative listen. Can you tell me a little what inspired you to start the podcast, and what is a full stack journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I've been thinking about starting a podcast for quite a while, and I never really had the right sort of topic, right? I felt like up until now, if I launched a podcast, it would just be yet another voice in a sea of voices, and it wouldn't really, I didn't have sort of the thing that I really wanted to focus on, right? And as I'm talking to all these people and I'm going to all these events and I'm speaking with customers and speaking with other IT professionals, and I began to get the impression that a lot of people out there were just sort of resting on their laurels. They weren't really pushing themselves. They weren't really driving, like a lifelong education. Like they weren't always going. They learned their thing and then they stopped. And that was their thing. So they were a storage gal or they were a networking guy and that was it. And they let that expertise sort of define them. And I didn't feel like that was really what we were supposed to be as IT professionals. Now, we could get into a whole side discussion about fixed mindsets versus growth mindsets here. And my son, who's big into psychology, would probably enjoy that. But for listeners in the podcast, we'll just kind of gloss over that. But I really felt like it was important that I, in some way, contribute to the community to help people recognize that we always have to be learning. We always have to be growing. We always have to be evolving and changing. That being an IT professional isn't just like, okay, I'm done now, but it's an ongoing thing, right? And so we have all these things that are kind of happening in the world, and we can talk about more about that in a moment. But we have all these things that are going on in the world, and I really felt like the kind of move to having someone who isn't just focused on one thing, but kind of can take a broader look at it was where we're kind of all pushing. Somebody who kind of can move up and down the stack of these modern data center technologies that are evolving, whether that be on premises stuff or off premises or, Windows, Linux, public cloud, private cloud, applications, infrastructure, like all of that, right? And so in looking at it, I felt like full stack engineer, even though that term has some connotations that people don't like, seemed to be the most decent fit. And so I picked it. But if you look at it, and this is something I talked about in one of my recent episodes, I don't know that it's ever really like completely achievable. So I thought the idea of saying, hey, this is a journey. This is where you're heading. There's value in pursuing it, even though it may not ever be something that you can fully attain simply because the technology always moves and we have to move along with it. And so that's where the name came from.
Okay. Yeah. That all makes a lot of sense to me. I know one of the reasons the podcast resonates with me is that I feel like I'm on my own journey to become a full stack engineer. I started on help desk and then I moved to desktop support and then servers and storage and networking. And most of that all happened at like a small business. It was only like 250 people, 3 IT guys. So we kind of had to do everything, even like fill the vending machines sometimes. And so we didn't have silos and I became sort of a generalist. And once I moved to bigger organizations, I found they had silos and it seemed in a lot of cases very inefficient, right? So I went into consulting and I found that my experience in all these different disciplines was really indispensable. How did your full stack journey begin and where do you see it going from here?
Well, much in the way that you described, Ned. I mean, my career was kind of what set the stage for me. I mean, I did departmental, end user type support stuff and then moved into being a trainer and an instructor and a lot of different technologies there. And then I spent my time in the VAR reseller space as a consultant and as a post sales engineer. For those who live in that space, they know the sort of, mile wide, inch deep feeling, right? We've all been there and that's fine. But I really felt like in addition to having sort of that broad view, you really needed some sort of deep expertise. And so I had the opportunity to really spend some time in the storage world. I spent, a number of years in the vSphere space, focusing on virtualization and hypervisors and all of that. And then with my recent move to VMware, now focusing on networking, but networking kind of as it pertains to all these other things. It's kind of, it's pulling me there, in terms of where I see it going, more networking, more automation, more cloud, both public and private. I think those are all things that are just going to be critically important.
Right. So it sounds like there's a few trends that are kind of pushing this all forward. And if you're the type of person who just sat back and like you said, I'm a networking guy, I'm a storage gal, and that's all I do, and you just send me your requests and I fulfill them, that person might have trouble retaining a job in a few years. Do you think that's accurate?
I do think that's accurate. I think that companies are going to be looking for people who can look beyond their own silo, look into what the other teams are doing, have enough knowledge to be able, not necessarily to go in and say to the networking team, oh, your networking design is all wrong. You need to do blah, 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 whatever this, but at least understand like, oh, okay, this is what they're doing and this is why they're doing it. And this is the impact that it's going to have on the storage design and the virtualization design, security design and so on and so forth. And here's the business value that all this offers to the business, right? Because all of that stuff is important. But if you're just, clicky, whatever, then there's not a whole lot of value there. I mean, organizations of today need to move faster. They need to do it very cost effectively. And so they're looking for IT professionals who can help them move more quickly and do so more cost effectively. And that's where I think this sort of idea of being a full stack engineer really plays into, that desire.
Right. And I hear you saying that providing value as an employee and an enabler for organizations. And that makes a lot of sense to me. You don't have a whole lot of value if you never update your skill sets in a climate where everything else is changing. If you refuse to change, then everything kind of is going to pass you by to a certain degree.
Agreed. Absolutely.
So the information in the full stack journey to me is really interesting. And one of the things I really like is that there's a call to action towards the end of each podcast. And I know that sometimes I attend a webinar or listen to a podcast and they get me all excited about a technology, but they don't provide me a way to, or a path to engage with it. And I know if I don't use it, if I don't get my hands on it, I lose it and I lose that enthusiasm. So I mean, what are some of the ways that someone could get started on their full stack journey? What are some of the ways that you perceive as a call to action or a way to get started?
Yeah, the focus for me with the podcast has always been that I wanted the podcast to be very practical, very actionable, so that when I talk to guests on the podcast, I tell them, okay, give me a specific example of how this can be used or how somebody can move forward or how somebody can get started. So this is something we talk about a lot. And really what it comes down to, if you boil it down to some of the fundamentals, it's about kind of two, maybe three kind of key things. First, you have to move outside your comfort zone, right? If you're a long time, Windows, expert, you've been using Windows since 3.1, right? and Windows inside and out. That's great. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? But it's time to kind of stretch your horizon. You need to move into something else. You need to see what else makes sense. Now, at the same time, you have to stretch your horizons, but you have to do so in a way that aligns well with the rest of your organization. So you work in a bigger organization. They're a diehard Microsoft shop, right? It's not going to do you a whole lot of good to say, oh, well, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to learn VM or vSphere, just as an example, right? Because they're a diehard Windows shop. They're going to be using Hyper-V. They're going to be using System Center. They're going to be using that whole suite of technologies, right? And it doesn't align well. And it doesn't show where there's business value. Instead, you need to say, okay, where is an adjacent area that I can move into that makes a lot of sense here? Oh, maybe I need to take a look at the networking side because I know Hyper-V. Obviously we have virtual machines that need to be talking on the network. So let me focus a little bit on the networking. It's just slightly adjacent to what you're doing now, but it expands you into a whole new area, right? So you have to expand to that new area. You have to push beyond your comfort zone, but you have to do so in a way that aligns to the rest of your organization, that will provide business value to your organization. So something that makes sense in terms of projects that are coming up or initiatives or efforts that the company has underway. And it has to be something finally that kind of builds on what you already know. Like, I just finished recording a podcast today with a networking expert, and we were talking about this, and he said, hey, you could go off and learn particle physics, but it's so far removed from exactly. It's so far removed from everything else that you're going to have a hard time getting started. You really need to kind of build on something that's adjacent to where you are now. So it all comes down to putting yourself outside of your comfort zone, finding something that has value to the business and is aligned with the rest of the teams in your organization, and is adjacent enough to what you know now that you're not completely sort of just totally lost by the minutia of what you're trying to learn.
Yeah, if you're a diehard Windows guy and that's all you've done for a really long time, and then you try to make a jump to a very foreign technology, you're going to find yourself very frustrated and you might just give up. Whereas if you kind of inch along, okay, let me try this thing that's closely related in storage or network land to what I do in my Windows. Okay, I get this. I can build on that and then step a little further outside of my comfort zone. What can I learn next? Yeah, I have a blog post that I wrote recently that was 3 things that I think are really important. The number one was make yourself uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable. But if you don't feel at least a little uncomfortable, you're probably not moving in the right direction, right? You've rested on your laurels.
Right. Now, I will add one caveat to that statement. And that is, I do believe that Linux is going to be alien. It's going to be different, right? But I really do think that you probably should try to spend some time there because it's just cropping up everywhere. And I think you're going to see that trend continue moving forward. So that's the kind of maybe the one exception. There's always an exception to the rule, right? That's maybe the one exception where you do have to step so far outside your comfort zone that you haven't spent any time with Linux because you're, like I said, longtime Windows user. I do think that's worthwhile.
Yeah, that would definitely be me in that case. And being a very long time Windows user, it's what I started using in college. And then, until a few years ago, it was almost all I used. And it wasn't until I went to a big organization that had some guys that were running Red Hat and Solaris and stuff. And I was like, oh, let me see what that is a little bit. And it was really nice to have seasoned engineers who could kind of show me the ropes a little bit and ease that transition from a pretty GUI to a command line. It's nice that has fed back into Microsoft doing a lot with PowerShell and a lot of stuff at the command line. They really want you to move away from the GUI in a lot of cases. So I feel like the two fed each other a little bit on that. So the full stack journey, it seems to be part of a larger cultural shift in IT. And I've heard it called like bimodal IT, which I'm not a huge fan of because I think that IT has long had to support both what's legacy and the newest movement, whatever the modern vision of IT is. I mean, there's still like VAX systems and mainframes running applications that we'll need to support for, the next 20 years or whatever. So the line of demarcation between legacy and modern IT is a little fuzzy. Let's say you're not an engineer, but rather like a manager or a CTO or a CIO, but you want to help foster that culture that embraces the full stack movement. What are some of the things that someone in that position could do?
Well, I think really what it's about here is it's about breaking down the silos, or at least providing the means whereby your teams can break down the silos. So I would say things like encouraging cross-silo or cross-team interaction, cross-silo, cross-team organization and education, multifunctional teams working on projects, even something simple as, saying, hey, every week we're going to have this informal brown bag lunch, or maybe, you provide lunch for your teams or whatever the case may be, right? And the networking team's going to get up and present one week, and the storage team's going to get up and present one week, and the server/operating systems team is going to get up and present one week or whatever. Just that sharing of knowledge is really, really important. I mean, the more that you can expose all of the IT professionals to all of the disciplines, the more they begin to see how what they do fits into a bigger picture. And that's really where you begin to see some value being added. So encouraging lifelong education, encouraging the free flow of information across teams and across these silos, and then encouraging interaction, education, and engagement across those functional teams, I think is really a great way to do that.
Right. So rather than just pitching it over the wall, it's not my problem anymore. Get those groups talking to each other and sharing information instead of just, clinging on to your information for dear life because you think that brings you job security. So I see that a lot. These are my secrets, and if I tell anyone else, I won't have a job anymore. Yeah,
I mean, the encouraging the free flow of information across silos. I mean, that's really, really important. If you look at the principles behind the term DevOps, and I'm hesitant to mention it because so many times it has its own connotation, right? But if you look at the principles behind DevOps, it was about making sure that teams were talking to each other and they understood the challenges that each team was facing, and then planning appropriately, right? That's really what we need to be doing. We need to make sure that the storage team is talking to the network team, who's talking to the security team, who's talking to the server team, who's talking to the facilities team, who's talking to the applications team, all of these things, right? So anything that I think managers or CIOs or CTOs can do to encourage that sort of cross-functional communication, don't be the one that encourages people to kind of hold on to their secrets. You need to share it. Information becomes so much more powerful when it's freely shared.
Right. I've definitely seen that before where just making the storage team or the network team aware of what you're trying to do, they can really help you, tune your design to work better with their environment and vice versa, as opposed to fighting each other all the time. Be like, no, I need it this way. And them saying, well, we can't do it that way because of these reasons. Much more collaborative environment just seems to make everything go a little smoother and also make your applications or services function better.
Yeah, I agree completely.
So, I mean, you mentioned DevOps, and the other big trends I'm seeing is like software-defined everything, cloud computing, and now, the big hype I've been hearing from all the vendors that come do presentations is hyper-converged infrastructure. I don't know how much of a reality that is and how much marketing hype that is, but all of them seem to be big drivers to adopt these new practices and ways of doing things. What do you think are the major trends driving the full stack engineer journey?
So I think a lot of it is the core principles behind DevOps, right? Which if you look at them, there are there are 4 or sometimes 5 that are listed: culture, automation, lean. That one is sometimes omitted. Metrics and sharing. Those are the kind of the key principles behind it. It's less about the technology and more about the people and the process than anything else. And the technology should model people and process on the back end. But if you look at that in turn drives a lot of different things and is in turn driven by a lot of different things. So the ever increasing use and relentless march of public cloud services such as Amazon and Google and Azure, the ever increasing pressure from organizations for their employees to, quote unquote, do more with less, which I believe you can only accomplish through greater levels of automation. And the rise of tools and other things that kind of cater to the developer to make it much more possible for them to deploy on infrastructure. And these are sort of the tools that evolved out of the principles behind DevOps. I think all of these things are driving this because, the reality is that infrastructure, the term infrastructure doesn't mean physical servers necessarily anymore, right? It could be physical servers on premises in your data center, and it could be virtual servers off premises being provided by a cloud provider. Either way, those are both infrastructure, right? So as you look at how do I manage that infrastructure? How do I optimize that infrastructure? How do I place applications on that infrastructure? How do I integrate different types of infrastructure to support that? All of these things are driving people who formerly only focused on one particular area to now broaden their view. If you're a storage professional, your view of storage can't be just a block array sitting on premises in your data center now. It has to be object storage. And if it's object storage, it can't just be on premises, but it also has to embrace the reality of an S3 or something like that from a public cloud provider, right? These things are just forcing us to change. And so I think it's kind of it's almost this tangled mess, but all these things kind of interwoven together are what driving the evolution of IT professionals to be much more multifaceted than we were in the past.
Right. I think that storage example is a great example because I have worked with storage guys and they just think, do you want block or file? Which array am I going to pull that from? And that's where it ends for them. And they're not aware of these other alternatives because they haven't kept up. They just, they know their array and they're happy with it. So I'm glad that you brought up that specific example. Now I know, you work for VMware on their open source cloud computing and SDN initiatives. So I imagine that's driven you towards the adoption of this full stack engineer attitude. In your day to day, what sort of tool sets are you using to get your work done?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I've talked a little bit on my blog about sort of the applications that I use and how I approach things. And I've talked about how, I have this, kind of consumption layer of applications, which is where information flows in. And then I have an organization layer of applications where I keep things organized and I use a quasi getting things done type approach. And then I have a production layer where I kind of produce output and I'm a Mac guy. So, I've been using, OS 10 for way before everyone else kind of discovered it back when we were still running on PowerPC. So a lot of my tools are shaped by that, but I also spend a lot of time in the open source world. And so most of my backend systems are all, Linux and, I use tools like OpenStack and KVM and, obviously, NSX plays in that space. So I have NSX in as well. And I'm using a lot of command line tools because I'm a command line junkie. So I have things like Vagrant and Docker Machine and all these other things that allow me to very easily kind of just pop into a terminal and induce, whatever it is I need to do. Right. So that's kind of where I am. I mean, I spend my charter, my day job with VMware is to kind of look, forward looking at where the open source world is going, specifically like in the networking space. And then, how do we allow NSX to evolve to meet that need? So all of the things that I do are kind of always with a spin on what does this mean for networking? What does this mean for virtual networking? And then looking at it from there. So, I spend a lot of time in the terminal, cause I'm a command line junkie. I spend a lot of time in a text editor, again, because I spend a lot of time with Linux and other open source technologies, which invariably, use plain text configuration files. So I'm editing text files, but I do most of my production in, like writing documents and stuff in a plain text format called Markdown. And then I'll turn that into, something else. So text editor is kind of my best friend, and then whatever else I need from there. So does that help at all? Or?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of text editors out there. Is there a specific one you want to call out, or just this the one that comes bundled with Mac OS 10?
No, don't use the bundled one. Definitely don't use the bundled one. So I have evolved in that space. I used to use one called TextMate, which is now open source. It wasn't at the time, but it is now open source. And it kind of went through this evolution where the developer had kept promising version 2 of the program, and it just never happened. And finally he open sourced it, and you just really weren't sure where it was going to go. So I switched from there to a very well-known Mac editor called BBEdit, which has been around for years and years and years. And it's a great piece of software. And I used that for a while. And then just in the last year or so, I have switched to an editor called Sublime Text. And one of the reasons I switched to Sublime Text is that it is cross-platform. So there's an OS 10 version, and then I have a Linux laptop sitting on my desk that I use as well. And so I can just switch back and forth between Sublime Text on my Mac and Sublime Text on my Linux box. And it's, kind of basically the same keystrokes and same ideas either way.
Right.
So that's been really, really powerful. But ultimately, it's the text editor that works best for you. So.
Right. Yeah. I use Atom for a lot of what I do. And it's the same thing. I just got comfortable with it. But yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
I did try Atom, because there was so much hype about Atom, and I really gave it a try, and I couldn't get into it.
No. One of the funny things is, so Microsoft came out with Visual Studio Code, which is like a super stripped down editor, and it looks exactly like Atom, basically. It's like they're waving their fanboy flag.
I've spun up code. Yeah, I've spun up Visual Studio Code a couple of times, and a lot of what it does is, for me, is stuff that I'm already doing elsewhere anyway. So I was like, okay, I'll give it a try, but it didn't really make a lot of sense. So I basically just stick in Sublime Text, and then, go run off and do whatever else is I need to do, whether it be, running Ansible playbooks or Markdown or whatever else.
Right. As long as it can just tell me that my JSON syntax is off, that's really all I want it to do. It's like, where did I miss the bracket?
Yeah. Sublime Text can definitely do that. But a lot of others can too as well. So that's fine.
Cool. And I hear you talk about Ansible a lot. I guess that out of the different management systems like Puppet and Chef, Ansible is kind of the one that you've fixed on for now.
Well, I started with Puppet, and I used Puppet for a while, and Puppet's a great system. And then a couple years ago, I said, I'm going to challenge myself. One of the things I do every year, and I do this publicly, is I set a project list for the upcoming year, things that I'm going to do for the upcoming year. And this isn't necessarily work related. This is like for my own personal development, right? And sometimes I do well, and sometimes I just absolutely do horrible. And I usually grade myself the following year, kind of what progress I made. So one of the things that I challenged myself to do a couple years ago was to move outside of Puppet and look at another tool as well. And so I looked at Chef, and I looked at Salt, and I looked at Ansible, and there was a fair amount of momentum around Ansible. So I said, okay, let me go with Ansible. Started using Ansible, found that I really, really liked. It's got a low learning curve. It's YAML everywhere, and YAML is super readable as opposed to some of the quasi JSON-esque Ruby syntax of Puppet, which may not be as readable, sometimes. And so I found that I really liked it, and that's kind of what I've settled on as my second piece. I don't mess much with Puppet anymore, but I'm thankful that I took the time to learn it when I did.
Yeah, I agree. Ansible's on my to-do list. Speaking of to-do list, that's very interesting that you kind of set yourself a list of goals at the beginning of the year, and sort of the fact that you do it publicly. Do you find that helps you achieve it, or is it just the fact that you have a list at all?
Thus far, the public aspect hasn't been a huge factor. I mean, there is the fact that I said I was going to do this, and then I have to hold myself accountable at some point, like whether I actually did it or not. sometimes things are outside of your control and you can't, there's nothing you can do. For example, I had on my public list that there was a particular book that I was going to publish this year, and things outside of my control just meant that that's not going to happen. Right. So it is what it is. Thus far, the public aspect hasn't been a huge impact other than sort of I've put it out there, so now I need to do something about it, rather than coming back at the following year and saying, okay, what grade do I give myself? F, right? I need to make some effort here so that I'm not a complete idiot. But more, it's just the matter of having the list and knowing that these are the things that I put careful consideration into, and that I decided that this was valuable, and I need to do that both for my career and for my own personal satisfaction.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I think having goals in mind ahead of time really helps you focus. I know a lot of the time I can start down one technology and be like, oh, but I need to do this, which means I need to learn this other language. Oh, but in order to learn that language, I need to install this thing. And then it's 4 hours later. I haven't learned anything except how to get frustrated. And I'm totally off my task list. What other ways do you stay focused when you want to learn a new technology and not go down these rabbit holes?
Some of the rabbit holes are unavoidable. The term you see often, I don't know if you've been exposed to this term, is called shaving the yak, or yak shaving. And there's all kinds of stuff about this, like if you search for this, but the idea is that it's just exactly what you described. And that is like, in order to do A, I need to do B. In order to do B, I need to do C. In order to do C, I need to do D. In order to do D, I need to do E. And E is completely unrelated to A. It's totally different. It's like I'm cleaning the kitchen because I had to do something else, because I had to get to something else, because I had to find something for my office, because I had to go, whatever, right? So it ends up being this totally crazy thing. And sometimes you can't avoid that. I mean, sometimes there's a necessary amount of prerequisite work that has to be done, and you have to do it. And that's that. And the fix for that, as much as you can, is to try and embrace automation, so that when you do have to spin up some systems or install some software or whatever the case may be, you have put in enough sort of structure around that it's not a big deal. Like, in other words, I need to spin up, 5 new Linux VMs. Well, you already have a template in mind, already have a base, Puppet manifest or Ansible playbook or Salt State that you can apply that will bring it to its point, or you're using, a Vagrant, and you can just quickly spin up a Vagrant box and do what you need to do. I mean, all these things are ways that, if this is something you need to do and you're going to need to do it more than once, you can go ahead and write the automation around it. And then next time you have to do that, it'll save you some time. So some of that's unavoidable, and you can minimize it by embracing automation whenever possible. The other way just to do it is that goal list, as you mentioned, and making the goal list both specific enough and yet also high level enough that you are on target with what you want to do, but you're not so down here in the weeds that you can't adjust slightly as you get into it. But sometimes you'll get into a new technology or a new area or whatever the case may be, and you'll find that your initial view of what that needed to be is very different than what it actually needs to be, but you didn't know that until you got into it, right? Like, you don't know what you don't know. And so being able to adjust a little bit with a slightly higher level goal may be helpful in that regard, rather than you getting frustrated that you went into it to learn Ansible to do X, and you found that using Ansible to do Y instead is actually much more appealing.
Right. And I really like what you said there about you don't know what you don't know when you're getting into a new technology. I feel like we come to new technologies with certain assumptions, and then those assumptions get completely blown away. And you have to sort of level set and remember what your original goal was, and move forward on that. So I'm assuming that you have some sort of home lab or home setup that you get to play around with all this stuff in. What is your home lab like, or is it in the cloud somewhere instead?
No, I do have a home lab, although I have been toying with the idea of moving it all into the public cloud. And I leverage a couple of different resources. I leverage my home lab. I also have a corporate lab. Some people have that, so I have a little bit of resources that I can leverage out of my corporate lab. And then I do leverage some cloud-based resources as well when I need to do certain testing or something and it makes sense. Running workloads constantly in the cloud is often cost prohibitive. So I do encourage people to use cloud-based resources because they make a lot of sense, but you want to make sure that you're using them in a way that makes sense, right? Going out and running some sort of long running workload may not be in the cloud may not be the most cost effective way of doing that. So you need to pay attention to that. But yeah, in my lab, I have just a collection of servers and some switches and a Synology NAS, and that's where I run most of my Linux workloads and OpenStack, NSX, that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I too, I like to run stuff in the cloud when I can, but like you said, to keep VMs running for a long time gets real expensive. I know the Google Compute Engine just announced, was it Google or, yeah, I think it was Google, just announced that they would have a penny an hour, instances that you can get that could be destroyed at any time. But if you're, doing some development thing, that's a really cheap resource. And I know AWS has their free tier and, Microsoft, actually, I don't think Azure has a free tier. They really should, but it'll probably happen since they seem to be. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, if you're just getting started in cloud services, Amazon's free tier is a great way to get started. I personally, and I actually, I'd love to hear from you, Ned, kind of what made sense to you, but me, being a long time kind of Linux guy, which that's actually one of the reasons that drove me to switch to OS 10 was because it was so much similar to Linux. Mm-hmm. From the command line, using bash and having some set of commands and all that kind of stuff. But, to me, the Amazon command line, like the tools that they use, it all kind of makes sense. And I tried getting into Azure and Azure just felt kind of weird to me, but I'm curious. I don't know. Have you tried both and which one felt more natural to you being a longtime Windows person?
Yeah, it's funny. I started on Azure mostly because that's, the VAR I work for is a Microsoft partner, and they wanted us to adopt the Azure cloud and try to, get our clients to work with it too. And the first version of Azure felt very awkward. The interface was clumsy. The commands at the command line were a little convoluted. And then they released the newer version of Azure, which is Azure Resource Manager. And that has drastically changed things. The interface makes a lot more sense. The commandlets seem to make a lot more sense. You have a lot more control over what you're doing. But recently we've been also making investments in AWS. So I've kind of taken over that role as well. And, stacking up the two, I definitely feel like Linux people wrote AWS and Windows people wrote Azure. But because Microsoft is doing a lot to embrace developers and Linux people, their newer version of Azure feels much more friendly to that.
Okay. Well, I was wondering if it was just me or if that played out in others, and it sounds like it does, that, Microsoft produced a solution that was a little more friendly to Windows people, and Amazon, being primarily Linux workloads, especially in the beginning, produced a solution that was a little more appealing to Linux folks. So it makes sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case as far as I can tell. And the other thing I noticed is that Microsoft has been gaining market share in Azure mostly by aping what AWS does and making it more friendly to Linux. So, they now have SQL on Linux, which is bizarre. And, you can run Red Hat in Azure, fully supported. So I feel like they've said, okay, maybe the people using cloud really do want good Linux resources, and if we can steal that away from AWS, we will. Yeah,
sure, absolutely. A quick thought regarding the home lab too, though. I think the type of home lab that you might run and what you might do with the home lab also has a lot to do with where you are in your IT career. Like I have a young man who just recently transitioned into IT. He's super excited about it, and he's got a great job working for a hosting provider back on the East Coast, and he's kind of, just coming in at the ground floor, and he's taking systems and building them and that kind of thing. And that makes a lot of sense for him. Like having a home lab with hardware and equipment, makes a lot of sense, right? Because that's where he is in his career. But at the same time, I also have people who have been in the industry for a long time and are focused more on kind of the higher level constructs that we often get called into. And for them, the presence of the servers in the lab really doesn't do anything for them. They'll use a CloudFormation template or a Terraform or something like that, spin up a stack on a public cloud provider, do what they need to do, and then tear it down. And that's what makes the most sense for them, right? So, if you're listening to the podcast and kind of trying to figure out, what makes the most sense, it also kind of has to do with where you are in your career and where you get the most value from that.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, like you've said before throughout the podcast, it's setting goals and then working to achieve those goals and kind of doing what makes the most sense for you and, whoever you're working for at the time. So that, building a home lab that has physical servers, if that's what you need to work on and learn, it makes total sense. I feel like having some physical stuff is good because nested virtualization doesn't always work out great. And if that's something you need to focus on, like building an OpenStack cluster or something like that, having the physical resources works out a lot better. Have you experienced that as well?
Yeah, there are some resources where you can do nested virtualization with a provider of some sort. A lot of it depends on your organization. I mean, VMware clearly has a big footprint in sort of the traditional enterprise. And so, if you are, wanting to get a job in the traditional enterprise where there's probably going to be a significant VMware footprint, running that off some sort of cloud provider may not be as feasible or as helpful as you would prefer. And so it may make a lot of sense for you to just, get some hardware. Now, the other thing is that, you can use the hosted, hypervisors, VMware's in particular, to run their enterprise virtualization stuff. So if you're a Windows or a Linux person or even a Mac person, you could use VMware Workstation or VMware Fusion, respectively, to actually run nested instances of ESXi and vSphere. And I know a number of people who do that. Like they'll buy one workstation class system and sit it on their desk. It's quiet, right? It's not like the big noisy servers that are in the data center, but it's quiet. And they'll stuff it full of RAM and CPU cores, and they'll run a whole nested environment. And that's fine too. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. So really it's a matter of, what makes the most sense for you. Is it using a hosted virtualization product like Workstation or Fusion or even a VirtualBox? Although just as a side note, VirtualBox doesn't support nested virtualization. So if you do want to run nested hypervisors, VirtualBox is out of the picture. Mm-hmm. But, using a hosted hypervisor may make a lot of sense for you. Running some servers in your basement or something may make sense for you. Running some in the workload with a provider or something of that nature may make sense to you. Or, blending them together as needed may make sense. And it's just a matter of figuring out what is most appropriate for you, where you are in your journey, what aligns with your business or your organization or your own career goals.
Right. I think a lot of people don't realize how much hands-on labs are available to them from the various vendors. I mean, they want you to get and touch their technology. So I know VMware has a bunch of hands-on labs. So does Microsoft and their Virtual Academy. I think Citrix has a ton of hands-on labs. They're like, use our stuff, learn it. Because then you become an evangelist for them if you like it. I mean, assuming you like it.
There are a lot of online resources that you can use that will help you along the way. Certainly VMware has a ton of them as well as others. And you're absolutely right. I mean, it's in the vendor's best interest to help you get a hold of their technology and understand how it works. So definitely take advantage of those wherever it makes sense.
I know VMworld is coming up soon. You're probably preparing for it right now. Are there any teasers or interesting tidbits you can share with the audience that won't get you into trouble? Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's going to be a ton of great content. There always is every year. So, if you have the opportunity to go, definitely take advantage of that opportunity. There'll be a ton of stuff there. I think the content catalog is already live. So you can go in and schedule out your sessions and see what you're going to, what you want to get into. For the networking, centric folks out there, we're going to have a ton of NSX content, that is just going to be good stuff. I mean, I know a lot of the presenters are just super top notch. There are some cool things planned. I can't really talk too much about them, because I do like my job. But I will say this. Last year, my boss, and I, and a couple other guys, we did a spotlight session. Now the spotlight session is supposed to be this, big session in one of the big rooms that occurs like right after the keynote or whatever. And, you expect 1,000 people in there or whatever the case may be. And we did a spotlight session that highlighted some very cool forward-looking things we were doing with NSX. And this is stuff that, it's not on a roadmap or anything. This is stuff that we're looking at and playing with and that sort of thing, right? Just to kind of give people the idea of what's possible. And so one of the things we showed off last year, for example, was running NSX on a public cloud provider like AWS. And that opened people's mind like, oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that, and then that actually offers a lot of value in some cases. So that's pretty cool. So all I can say is that there will be another spotlight session with me and my boss. So draw your own conclusions from there.
Well, we do have someone going to VMworld. Unfortunately, it's not me. I had to pick my conference. But I will tell him to make sure to attend that and take copious notes. That sounds really cool. I didn't know you. So running NSX in Amazon is a possibility. I didn't even know that was something you could do.
Exactly. And, again, this is not, what we showed last year was basically, proof of concept that this is possible and this is the value that it adds.
Mm-hmm.
So, my boss and I, his name is Guido Appenzeller. So just look for his name in the content catalog. I don't think they put my name in there, but look for the spotlight session. And he'll be talking about some of the forward-looking things that we're contemplating and playing with in the NSBU labs as we help drive the development of NSX. So I can't talk a whole lot of details about it, but there'll be some updates on things we've announced and also some examples of things that we might be able to do in the future.
Okay, awesome. That's about all I have. Is there any additional comments or things you wanted to bring up?
No, that's great. I just appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast.
Okay. Last question. I like to ask this of everybody. Don't think about it too hard. What is your favorite 80s movie?
Back to the Future.
Love it. Yeah. That's a great call. Great. So, if people want to know more about you and everything that you do, where should they look for you on the internet?
Sure. So my website is blog.scottlowe.org. That's where I've been writing for 11 years now. And so you can find, I do a lot of content there. The Full Stack Journey podcast that we discussed is available via iTunes. And you can also look at the show notes at fullstackjourney.com. And then I'm active on Twitter as well. At Scott_Lowe is my direct handle. And then if you're interested in interacting with the podcast, you can contact at FSJ Podcast. That's at Full Stack Journey at FSJ Podcast, which is the podcast Twitter handle. So if you have comments on the podcast or ideas or anything else of that, feel free to hit them up on Twitter, which is really just hitting me up. But,
Yeah, you just have that layer of abstraction, right?
Exactly.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Scott, for taking the time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we can have you on again sometime after VMworld to talk about big announcements or something.
Sure, you bet. Just let me know.
All right, thanks. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Special thanks go out to our guest, Scott Lowe, for taking the time to talk with me. If you want to know more about Scott, you can check out his website, scottlowe.org, or follow him on Twitter at Scott_Lowe. As you may have noticed, this interview was recorded before VMworld 2016 US, and so there have obviously been several announcements surrounding VMware's cloud strategy that Scott couldn't talk about. If you have the chance, check out the announcements from VMware. I'll leave a link in the show notes. VMworld Europe is taking place in Barcelona on October 17th, and I'm expecting some good news coming out of the event, including the release of vSphere 6.5 or maybe 7. That might be a great topic for the as-yet unnamed sister podcasts. Thanks to Catherine and Patty for helping me pull this together. We are now listed on the iTunes directory, so please check it out and subscribe. If you're feeling particularly generous, why not leave a review? I'd sure appreciate it. Thanks to Lee Rosevere and Professor Click for providing the music for AnexiPod. Thanks to Anexinet for helping me produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital, strategy, or technology needs, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet to see how they can help. And finally, thanks to you, dear listener, for tuning in. Without you, I would be a lunatic talking in a room to myself. If you'd like to know more about me and what I am up to, you can check me out on Twitter at Ned1313 or my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.